Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 64th meeting of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. This portion of the meeting, the first hour, is being televised. Today we are continuing our study of the Chief Electoral Officer's report entitled An Electoral Framework for the 21st Century, Recommendations from the Chief Electoral Officer of Canada following the 42nd General Election, with a specific focus on Recommendation B12, publishing false statements to affect election results, and B27, foreigners inducing electors to vote or refrain from voting. Although if people want to raise other items, I'm with the Commissioner while we have him here, I'm sure that's fine, or if he wants to raise items. In order to assist us today in our deliberations, we are joined by Yves Côté, the Commissioner of Canada Elections, and Marc Chenier, General Counsel and Senior Director of the Office of Commissioner. Welcome and thank you for coming here. This will be very helpful. The Commissioner has distributed to all of you his remarks, so you have them in writing as well. And I'll now turn the floor over to the Commissioner for his opening statement. And as I reminded you, we're televised this meeting.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the members of its committee for its invitation to appear today to assist with your examination of the Chief Electoral Officer's report on the last general election. As you said, I am joined by Marc Chenier, who serves as General Counsel and Senior Director of Legal Services in our office. Before I turn to the issues of interest to the committee today, as you identified, I would like to mention that there are several additional recommendations contained in the CEO's report on which the committee has yet to be reported that have a direct bearing on the mandate of my office.
Power to apply to a court to compel testimony, the authority for the Commissioner to lay charges, and the ability for contract investigators within our office to obtain production orders under the Criminal Code. These recommendations are extremely important for our office, and I would dearly hope that the committee will support them. Let me now turn to the two specific issues that were identified as being of interest to the committee. They have to do with the publication of false statements about the personal conduct or character of a candidate, and secondly, the prohibition on foreigners inducing electors to vote or to refrain from voting. Both of these sections raise, although admittedly in different ways, issues relating to fundamental democratic values. And chief among them is freedom of expression, which, as the Supreme Court has repeatedly stated, is probably at its highest in the electoral and democratic context. It is therefore essential for Parliament to proceed extremely carefully in this area.
The objective of any amendment should be clearly identified. What is it that should be prohibited or regulated, and why? And, more importantly, very importantly, the means chosen to achieve this objective should be as minimally intrusive as possible. Otherwise, there would be a risk that courts will intervene and find that Parliament, you the MPs, have overreached. Moreover, these general language in these provisions creates false expectations and a perception that these provisions are not enforced as they should be. As a result, it can lead into erosion of Canadians' trust in our electoral system.
False statements. Section 91 of the Act is one example where this problem exists. The language contained in the provision is extremely broad and does not provide an adequate degree of clarity as to the type of false statements that are prohibited. So, while the public believes it is applicable to a wide variety of scenarios, from an enforcement standpoint, the circumstances in which it can be applied are actually quite limited. The reason for this is that historically, the courts have set a very high standard on the concept of falsehood. For example, judges have ruled that in order for a false statement to be captured by provisions of this nature, it must falsely impute a high degree of, and that's the expression they have used, moral turpitude or criminality. In addition, as it stands now, only false statements about candidates and or prospective candidates are caught by Section 91. As the role of political parties and party leaders has grown considerably since the section was adopted in 1908, that is more than 100 years ago, it may be time to consider whether the scope of the provision should be broadened to include false statements made with respect to these other key players. Un dernier point.
Final point. At present, when a violation of Section 91 occurs and a conviction is entered, the appropriate sentence is imposed on the accused. Nothing else follows. An issue for consideration is whether other consequences should flow from a contravention of this provision. For example, should a violation of Section 91 be identified as an illegal act or corrupt practice? This could provide a basis for challenging the results of the election in cases where the false statements may have seriously impacted the results. This is currently the case for a contravention of Section 92, which prohibits the making of a false statement about the withdrawal of a candidate. Failing such changes, I think Section 91 should probably be repealed. Whether Section 91 is repealed or not, I would suggest that amendments to paragraph 482B should be considered in order to clarify its intent. This is a provision of broad application that is intended to fill any gaps in the Act's offence provision concerning deceitful conduct. While it makes an offence to use any pretense or contrivance to induce voters to vote in a certain way, the aim could be clarified to prohibit, for example, attempts to influence electors using means that are fundamentally opposed to our recognized democratic values or that undermine the processes laid out in our electoral legislation.
Provision, and this would be a major challenge, will be to ensure that it does not capture typical forms of political expression and debate, which often includes exaggeration and what is often referred to as political spin. The prohibition, ultimately, should not stifle debate or unduly limit political expression. Rather, it should aim to protect our democratic values, including transparency and accessibility. For example, it should target fake news in cases where the intent was clearly to confuse electors and undermine their ability to cast an informed vote. Let me now turn to recommendation B27. The breadth of the provision related to inducement by foreigners also creates a number of enforcement challenges. As the members of this committee will likely recall, in fact will no doubt recall, there were a number of examples of non-Canadians who, during the last campaign, expressed views or opinions either through social media, in editorial comments, or during interviews. We received at the office a number of complaints in relation to these types of incidents. Many believed that anyone who is not Canadian and not residing in Canada is prohibited from expressing support for a party or a candidate. Although a very literal reading of the provision could lead to that conclusion, it is hard to imagine that in this day and age, in 2017, Parliament would want to make illegal the expression of an opinion by a foreigner. Hence the need, in my view, to consider tightening and refining the wording of the provision. Comme la loi vise principalement à assurer
Considering the Act's focus on maintaining a level playing field, the focus should probably include elements that prohibit foreigners from incurring significant expenses to oppose or promote a candidate or party. These could include, for example, incurring expenses to pay employees to work in a call center or to organize door-to-door canvassing during a campaign. The CEO also recommended in C49 that it would be useful to review the wording of the provision to make it clear that it applies to attempts to influence electors. The use of induce in the English version of the Act causes confusion about what is captured by the prohibition. The reason for this is that it implies that for an offense to have been committed, the attempt to influence had to have been successful. This gives rise to an almost impossible burden of proof for the prosecution. Finally, I'd like to briefly mention one last area of potential reform regarding third parties in the election process. In Canada, third parties are only regulated with respect to their election advertising activities. Provided that they act independently from a candidate or party, they may incur limitless amounts of expenses when carrying out activities such as polling, voter contact services, promotional events, etc. They can also use whatever sources of funding, including foreign funds, to finance these non-election advertising activities.
in Canada's electoral process will likely continue to grow in the years to come. For that reason, Parliament should consider whether there is a need to re-examine the third-party regime with a view to maintaining a level playing field for all participants. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, I'd like to thank the committee for its support of a number of important recommendations concerning our office. In particular, I was extremely pleased to see that the committee had agreed with the recommendation that a regime of administrative monetary penalties be adopted. This recommendation, coupled with the ability to negotiate broader terms and conditions included in compliance agreements, would allow my office the much-needed flexibility it requires to carry out its compliance and enforcement mandate more efficiently. It would also, and I think this is a very important point, it would also facilitate the quick and efficient resolution of a number of matters in a transparent manner, eliminating the need to take some of them to court. As criminal courts across the country are dealing with the aftermath of the decision of the Supreme Court in Jordan, this is, I would submit, a highly relevant consideration. Pour conclure, Monsieur le Président, bien que...
Closing, Mr. Chair, although I would endeavour to provide fulsome answers to your questions, I would like to remind the members of this committee that I will not be able to discuss the details of any particular matter that is or may have been the subject of a complaint to or an investigation by my office. I would be now happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Very much. That was very helpful, and you're totally correct. We're looking at having some penalties in the Act, throughout the Act, possibly that are not criminal, so that's a very good thing. Just so you know, recommendations A33 and A34 that you mentioned at the beginning, the committee has dealt with already, but you have brought to attention to us that we hadn't noticed C45. The ability of contract investigators to obtain production of orders. So while you're here, could you just briefly introduce that recommendation for us from your knowledge and any comments you want to make about it, because we'll have the 3 recommendations to deal with after you've left. The 2 that you outlined in great detail, plus we might as well deal with C45 if you have any comments on it, because it is related to you. We haven't got to Section C yet in our deliberations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. C45 is what I would describe as being a rather technical amendment, and that's essentially why it finds itself in Chapter C of the recommendations. And it has to do with the fact that we have on staff at the office a certain number of contractual investigators, people who are not employees of the public service. And as the law currently stands, they are not in a position to apply for things such as production orders under the criminal code. Because these instruments, production orders, which, for example, we use to force a bank to give us information about financial transactions, these orders can only be applied for before a judge by public servants. So we have a number of investigators, as I said, who are contractual employees, and currently they are not covered by the criminal code. So what it would require is simply a very small amendment to make sure that currently contractual employees may apply for search warrants. This is already covered. But when these new provisions, the production orders, were introduced, I think somebody forgot to make sure that contractual investigators should also have the ability to apply for them. So that's why I say it's a rather technical amendment, and I don't think it should pose any significant problems.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And we will start the how many minutes? 7-minute round. So 7 minutes includes both the questions and answers with Mr. Sims.
Oh, yeah. Just very quickly, this is a crude example. Mr. Cote, thank you for your intervention here. Today there's an election in the United Kingdom. The polls are open currently. I truly hope, although they won't win government, that the Liberal Democrats will win more seats. I just said it publicly. If this was the other way around,
You will understand that I will not comment on that.
Sorry, what's that?
You will understand that I will not comment on that.
Oh, okay. No, I was just wondering if it was the other way around, would I be breaking the law? I guess what I'm trying to say is that, look, if I'm making a comment about their election the way I just did, if a British member of Parliament did the same thing to me, would I be infraction? Would this be against the law? As it stands, yes, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
As it is now.
As it is now.
I'm just looking for interpretation.
Don't think that you would be committing an offense as we have the law as it is now, because I think that any investigation or any way in which this matter would be dealt with, I think we would look at the freedom of expression guarantee that certainly the Charter extends to everyone. And before we decided to move ahead with enforcement action, we would be quite conscious of the need to bear that in mind. That's one point that we would certainly consider. On the other hand, I don't think that you would be breaking our law if you did that, or if he did that, or she did that.
Okay, all right, that's fine. David?
Thank you. Merci d'être ici. C'est un plaisir.
Very much for being here today. It's very good to have you. I have a question. Can you walk us through an investigation? So if you have a complaint about electoral fraud, what happens? And where are there problems with A34, 35, the Commissioner's authority? So if we have a complaint, as you say, about electoral fraud, we imagine that's something very major. So we start doing a preliminary examination of the facts that have been brought to us. And if we believe that there is really motive to launch an investigation, we will do one. And then we'll talk with the people who could be involved. The reason we have something like A33, in some cases, and I have seen it personally over the past 3 or 4 years since I've been in my position, we know that these people almost certainly, that they are aware of things, they have information, and for their own reasons, they refuse to cooperate with us. They tell us, I don't want to tell you anything. And as MPs, you can evaluate what I'm going to say, but often, in the way people who works in politics, they think that loyalty to their party and to their team is a fundamental value. So for these people, if they start to work with us and give us information that could help us do our investigation, it's very hard for them. So if, for example, if we've approached all the people we can and no one accepts to work with us, then there's a provision such as 833 could be very useful. Then we go to a judge, an independent person, and we say, okay, here's what's happening. Here are the allegations. We think they're serious, but we can't convince anyone to speak with us. Can you accept to do a production order to oblige someone to speak with us? And then the judge could accept to issue the order, and it would be obvious that the person, what they would tell us, since they were obliged to do so, could never be used against the person. They were allowed to have legal counsel, and it would happen in private and not in public. And so when you have these type of guarantees, it's really important. It's also important, Mr. Chair, to underscore that's not a power that we would use for just anything to investigate any minor issue. There will be very specific circumstances where the entire electoral system would be at risk, and we would have to do an investigation. We've tried to seek the information, and then additional steps would be taken then. So that's why we're suggesting A33. I think there are five or six provinces in the country when a person who is in the same type of position as the commissioner has this type of power. And this is the case in Quebec. On the federal level, it's something that already exists. The Competition Bureau has this power and can, in some cases, approach a federal judge to ask for an order to oblige someone to appear. So that is why we're suggesting A33. In real life, what happens with the commissioner and your office? What happens differently in the real world? So you have different buildings, you have ways of communicating. What really happens? In real life, as you were saying, since C-23 was adopted, we were extracted from the PBO's office, but in general, things are going very well. Where we have difficulties, it's on the technical side. We have to be able to exchange information more quickly, because right now there are two separate government institutions, and there are some regulations that apply and that make things a little more difficult. Nevertheless, you probably know that Bill C-23 has been tabled, and if it's adopted in its current form, it will apply to the CEO's office. Since we're part of the criminal prosecution, things have been exemplary to date, as we saw with Election Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, thanks for being here. A couple of questions that I have, I guess, for you today. First of all, in regards to the recommendation 27 that deals with Section 331 of the Canada Elections Act. Obviously, that prohibits anyone who doesn't reside in Canada, who's not a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, from inducing electors. This is actually taken right from it. Inducing electors to vote or refrain from voting, or vote or refrain from voting for a particular candidate. The recommendation states that you receive many complaints under this section, but indicates that overly broad wording leads to difficulty in the rule being enforced. But if many people are filing complaints, then there clearly must be some significant issues here, some real issues. You know, I always think of the saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. So can you give us an idea of how many complaints that you typically receive particularly, I guess, with those last couple of elections? And also, can you provide some suggestions on how we could look at strengthening that section that will give you the ability to better ensure the integrity of our voting system?
Yes. Mr. Chair, the question as mentioned that usually where there is smoke, there is fire. And sometimes I have to say sometimes where there is smoke, there is only smoke. And I say that because when you look at 331, as I said, I think in my opening remarks, you can think that it applies to all kinds of various things. And one of the things that was brought to our attention a number of times in the course of the last general election was comments or editorials or made in media, especially in the U.S., but also sometimes outside the U.S., and also pieces written or published in national Canadian newspapers, but authored by non-Canadian residing outside of Canada. And many people thought that this was objectionable and that this should not happen. And from my point of view, I don't think that 331, which was adopted, by the way, as I said, I think a long, long time ago, I don't think that the intent was to capture this kind of thing.
Okay, so can I? Sorry, I hate to interrupt you because I've only got a limited amount of time. So, what I was trying to get a sense of is the number of complaints that you receive, and you've obviously indicated that some of those you see as smoke being smoke kind of thing, but obviously there's probably likely to be some that are where there is fire in existence, and so I'm trying to get a sense as to how many complaints you typically do receive, and maybe you can give me an idea of the numbers or percentages that you think would be legitimate complaints. I guess how we could look at strengthening those sections.
Yeah, the numbers that we have now would suggest that we got 14 complaints in the course of the last general election having to do with possible infringements of Section 331. A number of those were disposed fairly quickly, and I made reference to that in my last annual report, and it had to do with a major national political party which was doing business with somebody from outside the country, presumably or allegedly trying to get some advice, strategic advice in terms of how a campaign could be or should be run. And we took the position publicly, and as I said in my report, to the effect that this was not something that was caught by Section 331.
So let me move as well to the other question that I had for you. When you were at the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee in April, you'd indicated that you'd had a number of complaints about third parties. I don't know if we're talking about the same subject matter here or not that you just indicated, but wondering if you can indicate whether that's become an issue, that third parties are so significantly involved that there may be unfair electoral outcomes as a result. Now, you also stated today, and I believe you had at the Senate committee as well, that Parliament should consider whether there is a need to re-examine the third-party regime with a view to maintaining a level playing field for all participants. Now, you also have indicated that when third parties are able to receive foreign funding and use that foreign funding during the election period, provided that they receive the funds prior to 6 months before the election is called. So that means that really third parties can use unlimited foreign funding, and that there's really no restriction on the amounts that they can use outside of election advertising. You said today that you believe we should look at the other expenses like polling, voter contact services, promotional events, and these types of things. So I wonder if you could maybe expand a little bit on that and give us an idea of any other suggestions you have that we could use to strengthen the third-party financing regime to ensure that there is that level playing field that you're talking about, that is maintained in relation to foreign funding, and specifically fleshing out this idea of the other types of expenditures that are completely unlimited at this point, and that 6 months. Do you think we need to go beyond that 6 month period so that there can't just be someone at 6 months and a day, especially with a fixed election date that obviously drops a bunch of money in and is able to significantly influence the Canadian election?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would start by quoting a judge of the Supreme Court of Canada in the Harper decision going back to 2004, and that was Mr. Justice Bastarache writing for the majority. And what he said was this: for spending limits to be fully effective, they must apply to all possible election expenses. The regime that we have for third parties was passed over 15 years ago, and yes, we very well know, only applies to what is referred to as election advertising as defined in the Act. And that is pretty narrow and pretty limited, and that is the production, if you will, of advertising material and the purchase of the means necessary to transmit such materials. So all kinds of other things are simply not covered at this point in time. And yes, as I said in the Senate, we have received a fairly significant number of complaints, way more than we had had for the previous general election, about people complaining that third parties now, in this last election I should say, did all kinds of things which had, they allege, an impact on the outcome of the electoral results, and that this was not fair. And what I said in the Senate and what I said this morning here is that I think that 15 or 17 years after the regime was adopted, the time has come for you, members of Parliament, and for Parliament to think about if we really have in mind to maintain a level playing field, should more be done with a view to addressing the role that third parties have played and, I would assume, are probably likely to play in the next general election. To me, the question as to whether or not we still have a level playing field is really an open question, and I would urge you to consider that very, very carefully.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll now go on to Mr. Stewart. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Stewart.
All right, thanks very much for having me today, and thank you for the testimony. I had a question about the foreign influence and how we regulate that. I was speaking with an internet advertising firm, and they said they have an ability to do something called geofencing, which is to take a geographic area and to buy all the social media, all the online ad presence in one particular geographic area. So, for example, an electoral district. So that's very useful for us because we know during our election that perhaps we could spend some of our advertising saturating our own local area with, election pledges and those types of things. However, my concern is that this technique can also be used by non-Canadians. Is that, say, we just had an election in British Columbia, which is very close. The balance of power hangs on one seat. And you could see somebody seeing that coming and saying, well, I'm going to buy all the social media, all the online presence within that one particular electoral district and try to push it toward one party or another. So if that's done by somebody, say a Chinese company decides that they want to do that and they flood this particular electoral district with hundreds of thousands of dollars of online advertising, what is the recourse under the current law? How do you, because obviously that's foreign money coming into our electoral system, but because it's through an online presence, it's how would you approach laying charges or investigating that situation?
As you said, this would raise very, very complicated and very difficult issues. For the purpose of simplicity, I will assume that there has been no cooperation with a Canadian party, let's say, or a Canadian player. So we have a Chinese company on its own doing that. It becomes very, very difficult, one, to investigate, as you suggested, and secondly, even if, assuming that you could get the information that you needed to proceed with a charge, then the only thing you could contemplate doing, I would think, on the wording of the legislation as it is now, would be essentially to lay a charge in Canada, and if the company has some presence in Canada now or at some point in time, you could take them to court and perhaps do something with respect to their assets if they were convicted. But if they operate only outside of Canada, in China, in the example you use, it is extremely difficult to enforce the legislation in circumstances like this.
What about going after the online? Say it's an online newspaper that has column ads, and that's what they're buying. Could you change legislation that you actually go after the website on which these are hosted, which would be hosted within Canada?
Well, assuming that there is this real Canadian connection in the example that you gave, you could possibly, depending on the facts of the case, you could possibly investigate and lay charges against the Canadian outfit or enterprise that did that on the basis that they became party to the offense committed by the Chinese company, again, in your example. So assuming you could show that the council only abetted the commission of the offense, then technically, legally, there are those steps that could be taken.
And does the Act as it stands facilitate that? Because this is something that I'm sure will, we've just had all kinds of testimony in the United States about how Russia is apparently influencing their elections. We've heard this now, it's spread to the UK and to Brexit, that referendum. Most of that would be through online spending. Some of it would be other means, hacking and those types of things. But a lot of it could be through advertising. Do you think there's improvements that could be made in the Act to help you stop what I think would be a new threat that would be coming in coming years?
Yes, there are improvements that could be brought to the legislation to make it easier to do that. At the same time, when you keep in mind that very often for us Canadians, the companies or the internet players, if you will, involved are outside of Canada, whether it be Google or Facebook, all kinds of issues always also arise in terms of trying to get to these companies in a legal kind of way to make them cooperate or seize the what they've been doing. And on that point, Mr. Chair, I would mention that in Germany, very recently, in the last couple of months, the government has taken steps to implement a system that would subject companies like Facebook and Google to pay huge fines. I think the maximum is 45 million euros if they fail to, when required to do that, to take off their networks fake news that have a... So that's one way that the Germans have apparently found to address the issue, but it is a very, very complicated issue. And you may know that this morning the Senate committee, before which Mark and I appeared a few months ago, just issued its report, which I only could glance at because it only came a few minutes before we came here. And they do a lot of thinking around those issues, and they formulate some recommendations that you may find useful and interesting.
Okay, thank you. Had another question about false statements. If you could perhaps give us examples of false statements. Say something that was an actual statement that was claimed to be false that you did not consider false and did not investigate, and an example of a statement that was considered false. Would you have those at hand?
Well, I have a couple of examples that I can share with the committee.
That'd be great.
One is a case going back to the 2000 general election involving somebody by the name of Shannon Jones. And in the course of an electoral campaign, she had stated that the outgoing MP, who was running again, had, I think the way she put it is that he had one of the worst attendance records in Parliament at only 53%. And she was saying something like, well, if anybody showed up for work only 53% of the time, they would be fired. And so she was charged with an offense under the provision at play here, and the judge found that this was not sufficient to justify or to warrant a conviction under the provision. And what the judge said is that the provision should be used where the candidate is alleged to be, and I'm quoting from the judge's reasons, a thief, a criminal, a felon, thank you, or that some sort of other serious moral turpitude was involved. And also, I think there are some cases, because, by the way, I think 6 or 7 provinces have essentially the same provision as we have here, and the wording is almost exactly the same, the personal conduct or character of the individual. And in another case, coming out of Manitoba, there the person had said that the candidate that was running against her was, and I quote, a liar, a thief, a drug peddler, and the judge in that case found that this was sufficient to trigger, and in fact she pleaded guilty, and she received, by the way, a fairly significant fine. So the point I would make on this is I think there is a need to, because many people in Canada think when they look at that provision that anytime a false statement is made about a candidate, let's say, that's enough to trigger this, and the courts are not there at all. They understand that freedom of expression in the political realm is pretty broad, and as I said in my remarks, political spin, insinuation, exaggerations are part of the way, for better or for worse, that electoral campaigns are run in this country and in many other countries. So courts will recognize that and will be careful before they intervene. That said, when somebody crosses the line and impugns somebody by way of, as I said, criminal conduct or fraud or anything like this, then the courts will be more open to perhaps considering issuing a verdict of guilt.
But your request is to just eliminate that power from your purview.
No, I'm not suggesting that. I think my opening remarks, what I said is that I think there is a role to be played by that provision, and I think the challenge for you, MPs, and for Parliament is to find a way to refine it, to make it better adjusted to the reality so that it's easier for us to apply, and so also that citizens, when they look at the provision, they understand that it is not any and all false statement that is caught by the provision.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Ms. Hoda.
Thank you. Yeah, my questions, thank you for being here today, Commissioner, and my questions will be based on recommendation B12. I have a little bit of confusion in your statement. I know that you want more clarity in the provision, and if not there, then you'd like it repealed. But in the first paragraph, you had stated that the provision is extremely broad, and that's what I understand it to be. But then in the third paragraph, I was a little confused when it said that it may be time to consider whether the scope of the provision should be broadened to include false statements made with respect to key players, these key players. So I'm just a little confused. I do think that false news, fake news, and a whole bunch of things, need to be addressed in today's world. We are seeing a lot of problems in election campaigns around the world. But we've already got a problem of this provision being too broad. So then I don't know whether adding more things will, in fact, make it even harder to implement. I'm just confused. If you could clarify, because I think I'm of the position where I would like to strengthen it, and especially given the current climate, I think that false statements about personal character is really important to me as a woman, because I do believe that women as candidates oftentimes have their character called into question more than male candidates, so I'm a little concerned about that. And so if you could answer that part of my question, then I have a follow-up.
Yes, and it's probably my not expressing myself clearly enough, so I'll try to clarify what I meant when I said that perhaps there would be an issue in terms of whether it should be broadened. What I'm saying there is simply that 91, as it reads now, only applies to candidates or prospective candidates. And yet, people could make some very, very damaging comments about, for example, a political party or a senior organizer in a political party, which by the nature of what these words would be, would have a very, or could have a very detrimental effect on the outcome of an election. So the question that I'm putting to you is, well, when this was passed in 1908, we didn't have perhaps the same kind of involvement by senior officials of parties or parties. And so that issue, to me, is an open issue in terms of whether you'd like to broaden it, and that's why I'm saying this. And in terms of narrowing it, what I'm suggesting here is looking at the way in which courts and judges have applied that provision in various court cases, you find that they are looking for something that's pretty narrow. So things, for example, when one of the judges said that if you make a comment about the way in which somebody carried out their official duties, well, that's, there will be a lot of leeway that will be given to people making those kind of statements. But if you impugn or attack the personal reputation of somebody, that's something else. And that's why I'm saying to you that false statements, you may wish to add words to clarify, so that courts have an indication of what it is that Parliament would like them to do, or would like the legislation to say.
Okay.
And also, I'm sorry, Madam, I'll just add this. As I said at the outset, we are in the realm of freedom of expression. So it is extremely important for any new legislation, if you decide to open it up and change it, to bear that in mind. The court will give lots of leeway to people expressing themselves in the course of a political debate, and so you have to make sure that your objective is clearly outlined and defined, and that the means that you use are as narrow as possible to achieve the goal.
Of course, and I mean, I'm sure you have these occurrences happen where people allege false statements that are in political debate, but I think most of us around the table here can agree that if you're debating an opponent and you're talking about the way their party voted, or what they had implemented, that is political spin at times, and can be seen in different perspectives. For example, though, I had my Conservative opponent, Mr. Gill, in my last election send out letters to each individual household in my riding, stating that implying that I had supported a private member's bill and introduced it into the House, but I had never been a member previously to running, so I was a new candidate. False statement, definitely, but there was previously another member with the same first name as me. So by eliminating the last name and sending out a letter to each doorstep, you can state that somebody by that first name had done this, but it was during my election campaign, implying that I had introduced this bill. So I mean, that's where things get murky. It's a false statement, but I mean, I never thought of even taking that to this, making a complaint about that necessarily. Because I think there's ways to address that through media, through responding back to allegations like that. But it's the personal character that really bothers me. And as we want to encourage more women to run, I do feel that we should not send a message that we don't care. As an election body, we don't care if these types of things happen in a campaign. We should be sending the message that yes, on the books we have something, but it is enforceable, and I want to help you to make it enforceable. So this illegal act or corrupt practice, how do we make it an illegal act or a corrupt practice? Because it doesn't go that far, you said.
That would be easy enough. There are provisions in the Act which set out which are illegal acts or corrupt practices, and that's Section 502 of the Act. So if you decided to go that route, it would be a question of adding a paragraph to one of those two sections to make it clear that from now on this would be that. At the same time, I think it's important for me to highlight for the committee, Mr. Chair, that if consideration is given to going in that direction, I would urge you to think very carefully about, because if you did that, that could open up the possibility to challenge the results of an election. And I think one of the things you would want to avoid, or at least to consider seriously, is to avoid having a multiplicity of challenges after an election that somebody said, well, he made that false statement about my personal character, and now I'd like to challenge the result of the election. And so, if I may just add the following, I think I would urge you to think very carefully where you would set the bar in terms of how such a challenge could be launched, and then give as precise as possible guidance to the court, to the judge, in terms of how they should decide whether or not there is room, or there is the results of the election should be quashed.
Okay, 30 seconds, just, so yeah, I would love, I don't have enough time now, but love more input on how we can make it enforceable, but not maybe take it that far, so we don't have that occurring time and time again.
Thank you, Ms. Soda. Just before I go to Mr. Richards, I just want to reiterate something the witness said, is that it's sort of serendipitous while we're talking about recommendation B27 from Section 331 of the Act about prohibition of foreigners introducing electors to vote, that this morning the Senate tabled its report on controlling foreign influence in Canadian elections. So, Mr. Richards, you're on.
Well, this is a great segue for me because I actually wanted to mention that as well and ask the commissioner in that regard, because the Senate did actually put out this report. I don't know if you've seen it yet. It just came out, controlling foreign influence in Canadian elections. They made a number of recommendations in order to ensure that foreign funding isn't playing a direct or indirect role in Canadian elections. Things like prohibiting the influence by foreign entities, modernizing the regulation of third parties' involvement, increasing penalties, and also the 6-month limitation being removed on that requirement to report contributions. And then, of course, also they're asking that it would require Elections Canada to perform random audits of third parties' election advertising expenses and contributions that they received that may be used during an election period. So those are some of their recommendations that they made, and obviously you've indicated to us that you think we need to be looking at third-party financing and considering modernizing and updating that. You indicated in response to me earlier that in order for provisions to be able to be effective, they must apply to all possible election expenses. So I would assume that means one of those suggestions you would make, and I'm looking for your suggestions on what the committee can do, because I think I firmly agree with you that we should be looking at this. This is an issue that needs to be dealt with, and I would assume from that when you say it must apply to all possible election expenses, you're indicating that this provision that it's only for advertising expenses is not broad enough, and you believe that we need to expand that further. I'd love to hear your thoughts further on that. I'd also like to hear your thoughts in particular on the 6-month limitation. Because with the fixed election dates, as I mentioned earlier, everyone knows when 6 months before the writs drop, if they want to get that money in, they do it 6 months plus a day, and nobody knows. Nobody's the wiser. And there can be very significant foreign funding, and it can seriously influence our election as a result. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on those two things.
I'll say 3 things. One is we got the Senate report literally half an hour before we came here, so I only flipped through the pages, and I cannot comment in any way on its contents. Yes, it seems to me that things, for example, like the organization of rallies by third parties. Currently, the position that Election Canada and we have taken is that this is not advertising, political advertising, or electoral advertising, and therefore, right now, as we stand, a third party may conceivably expend a huge sum of money in organizing rallies, maybe in various cities across the country, spending many thousands of dollars, and because this is not technically electoral advertising, this is not regulated in any way.
Or it could be things like paying for.
I'm sorry?
Could be things like paying for door-to-door canvassers as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of things,
totally.
So you're
saying
having broadening that would be helpful.
Or having people working the phones and trying to get people to vote one way or the other. Quite clearly, this is currently an open field, and people are free to do a number of things. On the 6 months rule, it seems to me that I really think that this should be looked at very closely, and perhaps steps taken to eliminate it totally, or to make it in such a way where much more is caught and regulated than is the case now. No question.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. I firmly agree with that as well. In order to ensure that more of it is caught, this idea of performing random audits of third parties' election expenses, would that be something that would be helpful in ensuring that more of it is caught?
Well, assuming that the legislation, the new regulatory framework was such that much more things had to be reported on, and also that there were some limitations, certainly spot audits would be a good way of, get the information that perhaps is needed to discover illegal actions on the part of some of these third parties.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Is there any other suggestions that you have if we're going to look at that? And I firmly believe we should be. Is there any other suggestions you would have on things we could do to modernize that and increase penalties, or other things we could do to make sure that more of this is being caught, more of this is, we're ensuring that we're keeping foreign influence out of the elections? And if you don't have any suggestions you can give us verbally today, would you endeavor to provide us something in writing that would be helpful?
Yeah, we could provide you with additional ideas. certainly one suggestion that I would make is not necessarily to have more severe penalties, because I think some of those provisions are the penalties provided for are quite severe. For me, the real challenge, the real objective you should pursue is to identify what you want, I say you, but I mean what Parliament wants to do in terms of how do we want to limit third parties in what they would be allowed to do or partially allowed to do. And at the same time, yes, Mr. Justice Bastarache said what I said a few minutes ago, but at the same time, the courts, as you probably know, have invalidated third-party spending on a number of occasions in the past. So it's a very, very delicate area in which to go, and you really have to be careful how, once your objective has been identified, how you go about accomplishing it.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your suggestions and your thoughts.
Thank you, Blake. We just have a couple minutes left for the last questioner, Mr. Chan.
Commissioner, Mr. Attorney, I want to thank you also for appearing today. I wanted to follow up some of the comments from my fellow colleagues about particularly recommendation B27, inducements by non-residents. And I want to deal with a very specific example that is in my mind and wanted to get your thoughts about it. I have within my riding a fairly large number of schools that provide services for foreign students, international students, who come to Canada in order to often complete a secondary school and prepare potentially for continuing their education in Canada in a post-secondary level. And one of the things that often comes up, and it certainly happened in my election, is their interest in participation in the Canadian political process. And one of the requirements that they have, for example, is to get enough volunteer hours, which was a requirement for graduation in Ontario. They need 40 hours. And so they often come banging on my door and say, we'd like to help you in your election, and do we get any volunteer hours? But these are essentially non-resident international students. Do they breach the Act under the current provision of Section 331 by participating in a Canadian election?
331 says that no person who does not reside in Canada, so presumably
non-residents, right? So they're here on a temporary basis, right? They're residing in Canada, but they're still technically temporary residents, not. So they're non-resident. They don't have status in the sense of being a Canadian resident. Or would that be, or am I technically, they're fine because they have this temporary status?
Well, if they are studying here, I would say a good argument could be made that in fact they are, even if only temporarily, that they are residing in Canada.
Again, I'm just concerned about that particular. I mean, I know the current recommendation is the repeal of the section, and I agree that it's the most difficult part related to this normally is enforcement, particularly for those that reside wherever they reside in, right? If you're, blogging about the Canadian election and they're living in Burma, I mean, it's kind of hard to actually, have any kind of, you can say, yes, they're attempting to influence our election, but there's no real practical enforcement mechanism. And I'm sensitive to the issues that Blake and others have raised with respect to foreign influences, but in the world of social media, and I just don't know how we effectively, other than as it relates to actual resources like monetary, that we can have any kind of regulatory control over this type of activity in this day and age.
It poses a very serious challenge. There's no question about that. And I think many countries around the world are trying to grapple with this, not only in the electoral context, but in other contexts. And it is certainly not a simple issue. By the way, Mr. Chair, I think Mr. Chan said that my recommendation was to abolish 331, and that is not my recommendation. My recommendation is that, you should look at it with a view to perhaps refine and
possible.
Yeah.
Right. And if you can't, then repeal it.
Okay, Commissioner, just before we finish, would you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
If I may, and perhaps out of the blue for members of this committee, we get a lot a lot of complaints about missing taglines on political signs during the campaign. And sometimes the taglines are not missing. It's only that they are printed in a slightly off color that makes it very difficult to read. And by way of perhaps trying to address this issue, and sometimes we have to actually use magnifiers to see that it is there. And once it's there, we have to drop the investigation. So if there was a way for you to recommend or to propose an amendment that would say that the taglines have to be reasonably visible, that would remove a big headache for a number of us. That's a very small point, but by way of a parting comment, that's a request I would make.
That's the line that says it's approved by the official agent, authorized by the official agent of the party.
Yeah.
And just on the election signs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. That was very helpful input on the recommendations that we're going to deal with now. And we'll just suspend for a couple of minutes while we go into camera.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.